Okay, so we are part two for our Neolithic screencast, and I have a couple more images to share with you. We're going to start right here with image number 10 in our AP Art History books. This is called Tlatelolco female figurine from central Mexico. It was found at the site of Tlatelolco from about 1200 to 900 BCE. We are looking at ceramic or terracotta clay, and she's very small. She's only about 4.5 inches tall. So starting with the function of these figurines, we know, first of all, I want to clarify that she's not a one and only, that lots of these figurine types were excavated and found in this region. They're of all different characters and poses and figures, and there's a lot of them that were recovered. But AP Art History wants you to understand her specifically. It is important when AP provides us with an image. It's important that we understand the information about that specific image, but they do expect you to understand like the overall contextual understanding that there may have been multiple of these produced, kind of like when we talked about we sometimes get images of ruins, and then we need to be able to understand what it looked like originally. And then sometimes, like Running Horned Woman, you get an image that is of a rendered remake, because the original might be so difficult to see. So you just got to be aware of that. But anyway, she's part of a series of figures that we believe were burial figures. They were buried with the dead and probably accompanied the dead throughout their afterlife journeys. We also think that this one in particular could have served as maybe some sort of fertility symbol. When we look at the exaggerated features of this Tlatelolco figure, we're looking at a female form with extremely exaggerated hips, poignant breasts, and we're able to really see that female figure. It's unknown. These are just theories and possibilities, but as we collect further information, we're able to build some theories about her. Contextually, though, this culture is very interesting because it's a culture that we don't know much on. We do believe that they were kind of taken over by the Olmec culture and absorbed maybe into that culture. But the name Tlatelolco, I think, is very interesting because that's technically not the name of the culture or that civilization. It's a name that has been given to this, mystery civilization. And Tlatelolco, when you translate it, it means the place of hidden things. So I think that's interesting contextual information. This civilization resided in it was a large farming village in the Mexico Valley, and this is a very lush area and located by water, so there was bountiful and plentiful fishing and bird hunting and agriculture. So they really flourished for the time that they were there. We know that some clues of their artifacts really led us to believe that they practiced shamanistic rituals. Remember, shamanism is kind of like a medicine man. I feel confident in saying man because really most shamans that I have studied have always been men. But they're like a medicine man that kind of act as a liaison between the spirits or the gods and the people in the village. They're able to work with nature and kind of work with this mystical power that they have to aid their village and the people in the village, whether it be with illness or whether it be with, having a good harvest, things like that. Um, so we believe there was definitely some practice of shamanism. This region historically is better known as the Aztec region. That's kind of what this area is known for. That would be central or modern day Mexico City. But this culture was well before the Aztecs, probably almost 3,000 years prior. So we're really looking, way back. And again, a big reason why there's still a lot of mysteries about this culture. Because modern day Mexico City sits atop this region, any sort of archaeological study or excavations are very difficult. I mean, it's a contemporary metropolitan city, and it's very hard to get to the land beneath it to do further study on past civilizations. In terms of content, for her specifically, what we're looking at is, a woman that has this double head or two, double faces. She has like very exaggerated hips, poignant breasts, kind of a facial expression on both sides of her faces. We are also looking at, just like running horned women, hopefully you're noticing that connection, that we have unfinished hands and feet. So again, that's probably just, information that's unimportant, so it's left out. It's also parts that are very difficult to render, especially three-dimensionally with clay. So they just kind of leave them unfinished and let the viewer be able to, know and understand and complete visually what's supposed to be there. But unlike Running Horn Woman, look how, static she is. She's, like frozen in time. There's no movement or anything being depicted. She was originally very colorful. You can see that some of that pigment has faded away off the surface, but when she was all intact in terms of pigment, we're able to really see great details in terms of clothing. Other figures allow us to see maybe what kind of trades that they did, or craftsmanship that they did. Um, Pastimes, playing, leisure, sports, things like that. So we're able to learn a lot actually about the people of this culture from these little figurines. It's more common that the figures were females, but I mean, males were very rare. We do have some, but females were definitely more depicted, which is another reason that maybe um, anthropologists and archaeologists believe that these maybe had something to do as a fertility symbol, or maybe it was actually, some sort of like matriarchal culture that really paid homage to their women. Maybe not necessarily in a hierarchy, but just as a terms of appreciation, because that's really linked to fertility, especially in prehistoric times. The understanding that the survival of their people and of their culture, really depended on the women and, the mysteries of fertility at that time. So in terms of form, what you really want to be aware of is that this particular woman, she's got this double-faced. There are other figures that have this double face, but not all of them. Most of them are just single face. So for the few that have these double faces, we're trying to read into the symbolism, and, what can that mean? And since we believe that they are perhaps some sort of like ceremonial burial figure, that maybe this represents like a duality, or something that the double heads and the double faces can depict the concept of life and death, or the circle of life, or your life and your afterlife. So that's some of the theories and interpretations for this double face. um, Also, in terms of form, what we have here, and if you take away anything from this figure, I want you to take away that part of the innovation that I would also give is that we have development of figures that now show expression. So these figurines are so expressive. Everyone is unique. Everyone has a different type of emotion or expression. So, most of the figures before her were kind of expressionless. It was more about the form and the figure, and just representing a human form, a human body. But now we're getting into details of the face, and giving the face the ability to express and show emotion, and kind of help. You could tell that observation and duplication are definitely increasing and becoming more sophisticated. A lot of these figurines can be, very humorous. A lot of them are allegorical, which means they tell a story, and it's mainly a story about daily life. It's kind of like recreating the culture or the civilization, but in little figurine form. The way that she was made was out of terracotta clay, and she was simply formed by hand, just by kind of pinching and sculpting and shaping with your hands. All of the color was added by pigments, the same pigments that Horned Woman in Algeria was painted with, and even Lascaux, all the Hall of the Great Bulls. It's the same materials that are mined from the earth and then mixed with some sort of binder. Usually that's, some type of animal fat, and then turned into a paint. So it's the same thing, but instead of going on rock, it's going on clay. And then the clay is baked in the sun, and in a fire, like an open fire, to help bring the clay into more of a finished rock. And that also helps the pigments adhere to the surface. Okay. This is a sculpture that is definitely sculpted in the round. So what that means, from front, to the side, to the back, it's completely sculpted dimensionally. And what I mean is, the opposite would be like if the back was just like flat slab. Okay. So it's not. That's what sculpted in the round means. It means that the same kind of form and curves that you see on the front, you will also see on the sides and the back. Now, with that being said, even though it's sculpted in the round, it is still a frontal sculpture. It's meant to be viewed from the front, and everything else, on the sides and on the back, are very unimportant information. There are no details in the sides or in the back. I think it's really important for us to notice the detail in the face, and to kind of make note of the care and the concern that's happening in the face. I'm going to move on to the next slide because I have a close-up of the face. Okay, right here. So taking notice to the impressions of the hair, and just the face alone really tells us a lot about this woman and the people a little bit. I mean, for starters, looking at the hair tells us how women's hair were worn up. You can see the textures in the hair, but then you can also see these small little dots and balls that probably represent a braid that then was, lifted and brought up to the top of the head. We're able to see details in the ears and the way that they're so circular and cylindrical can tell us perhaps that they did body piercing and wore some type of earring. But you can see that there's a lot of care given to the details in the face and the expression. Okay, I put in a couple more Tlatelolco figurines. Here's a mother with child. This kind of looks like a shamanistic Tlatelolco figure just because of the headdress and the clothing. But you can see again, the body shapes are pretty similar, and the hands. Well, these actually look broken off, but you can see in the mom here. I mean, they're just really kind of unrefined, but it's not important information. The same with the feet. They're just that the legs just kind of come to an end. Over here on the right, I added some other contemporary Mexican sculptures because I wanted you to think about that concept again of ethnographing that we touched base on during Paleolithic art, and how not only is that one way to study artifacts from prehistory, but it also just proves that there is some validity in ethnographing, because if you think about the time that Tlatelolco flourished and these figures were being made to now in current modern Mexican culture, that they still value a lot of the same artistic habits and artistic traits. Um, we, Mexico is known for their artisans and the production of small figurines in a variety of ways, in ways to commemorate the dead and deceased family members, where they have holidays of El Dia de los Muertos, where they are, going to the graves and celebrating the dead, to these expressive, just wonderfully stylized and expressive little figures of animals and skeletons, and these are called Oaxacan animals, to actual people that they pay homage to. So this is a little figurine of Frida Kahlo, who is a revered artist from Mexico, but also figurines that represent their faith and their religion, and their traditions in Catholicism and worshiping of their Guadalupe. So it's like these traditions. I mean, they're so similar, and after all of this time, you can see literally a direct connection, and this shows that culture and heritage in many ways stays intact for all of these years and for all of these generations and all of these eras. And so that there is some clout when you kind of try to understand artifacts through ethnographing. Okay, our next image is image 11. It's called Terracotta Fragment. It's from the Lapita people, which is from the Solomon Islands, from about 1000 BCE. And again, this is terracotta clay. And what we're looking at are shards, just a couple broken pieces from a larger piece of pottery. The shards allow us to see the patterns that were stamped and incised on the pottery, and that's really kind of our focus. Since this is actual utilitarian pottery, we know that it was a storage container, probably because of its size. It was not for cooking or for individual use. The size did not warrant individual use, but we also know it wasn't used for cooking because there was no carbon that was trapped into the clay, like from being over a fire. So this was definitely a storage container. And the cool thing is, this is kind of our first solidified function in our prehistory content area. So I think that right there is a way to show that, there's growth and we're coming closer to understanding, early human civilization. So contextually, some things about the Lapita people. They're located on the Solomon Islands, and this is part of a clustering of islands in Polynesia, Micronesia. And they're ancient people who were really known for their decoration and their patterns. And through their patterns, they created very complicated design systems. Um, the elements that they used to make the patterns, like dots and dashes and lines and circles, were very simplistic. But the way that they organized these elements together in a repetitious pattern were very sophisticated. Um, these patterns also that they created were very isolated and unique. So what that means is we are able to very clearly see the Lapita people's style that is kind of unlike any other style. So it allows us to kind of trace shards and know what culture, what tribe they belong to, because they have developed the style. And with that being said, these shards that we've found, not just these three, but multiple, right? Multiple shards that have been found, they've been found over many islands, not just one area on the Solomon Islands, but through multiple islands, thousands of miles apart from each other. And what that alone tells us is finding this same style on all these different islands, thousands of miles away from each other, is clearly the Lapita people were very good navigators, and they may have traveled quite a bit, and obviously were able to navigate the oceans quite well. We also believe that maybe the origin of the Lapita people actually came from Taiwan, and then came over to the Solomon Islands and settled around there. So again, we talked about how it is so important to understand the origin of where the artifacts were found, because that information alone can tell you a lot about the piece, but also tell you a lot about the culture. Okay? The other thing we know is that terracotta clay was not native to many of the islands that the shards were found on. So, these islands are mostly made of like volcanic rocks and limestone, and really you don't get a lot of clay. So, again, that tells us that maybe they were travelers and navigators and were able to really kind of, journey through and travel the oceans very successfully. Um, the restricted patterns and motifs, again, talking about that ethnographing, are still found in the culture today. And they're found in things like contemporary tattooing, bark cloth designs, which is something we'll learn about later when we get into oceanic art, and other forms of art. So that they have, again, through all this time and all these generations, have continued these specific patterns. In terms of content, what we're looking at, and you'll definitely need to look closer in your book, but we're looking at anthropomorphic shapes and faces. So remember that term, anthropomorphic. You're going to hear it again. It's an important AP term, but what that means is having, some sort of human recognition, human form. It's one of the oldest human faces found in oceanic art. So, the first evidence we have of people in this region trying to replicate or duplicate the human face or the human form. These shards are one of those. And these motifs, these patterns that they make are, repetitious but very restricted design elements. So again, what that means is by just using line and shape, two elements, we have multiple repetitions of that to create a variety of motifs. So it's like, if you were only using two ingredients for a recipe, but yet you were able to make, 50 different dishes out of these two recipes. It's kind of what they're saying. So we've talked about form quite a bit on this one, so I'm going to get through it, but a few things you need to know is that a lot of these patterns were stamped, and it's just like it sounds. So by using some sort of tool, the designs were, pressed and stamped into the clay. There's also evidence of a little bit of carving, so using a sharper tool and actually kind of digging into the clay, but mostly stamping. We have also, from the shards, you cannot tell, but wherever the stamping was, okay, whether those were dots or dashes or lines, at one time were white. And they were white because within that carving or within that impression, a white pigment would kind of be brushed over it and then gently wiped away from the surface so that the pigment would only sink into the stamps and the carves and the rest would be wiped away. So in its finished state, it was this red terracotta clay with some white designs on it. So it was like this red and white patterning. Okay, we know that they were hand built. There's no evidence of using any sort of a wheel like the ibex motif, but they're built by hand and then kind of paddled into shape. They're fired outdoors in an open fire, and like I said, used for storage purposes. Here are just some close-ups because I wanted you to be able to see that anthropomorphic shape here where we can it's almost like a mask, which is very stylistic of oceanic art, but we can see a human form here, some arms that are outstretched and a bit of a torso here. But this also allows you to see how these patterns were stamped, okay, and very, very detailed when you get close up. Giving you just kind of a look at, here we have Taiwan, where maybe they had originated, and then all these shards were found amongst this whole area. So really tells us that not only were they able to move around, but they were able to navigate rough waters. And then this is an example of that, white inlay on the red terracotta. So you can see how that red and white would have looked. Here's another close-up. So I've left you with this slide because that concludes our Neolithic. So, what we've covered so far is we've done an entire content area of global prehistory, and we divided it into Paleolithic and Neolithic. And those of you that are really linear thinkers, I went ahead and put all of our image in a linear timeline here to kind of help you see that progression and that growth. And then here are some main points of prehistoric art, things that you're going to want to review and make sure you understand. And congratulations, our first content area has been covered.